George ended up testing by himself. Ended up doing VADA testing by himself. Johnny Hendricks did no testing for that fight.
Hmm.
And we're all about that. Okay, whenever we're asked to test this, and I've said this years ago. Okay, when George was in his prime, I said,
The guy who was interviewing Paul, he came to the defense. Like, I don't know if they're actually friends or not, or if he's just like, being favorable because he's interviewing him, but he's sort of like more on the social media side than the actual, you in the trenches kind of side with actual fighters. So he was saying how he was kind of making a comparison to GSP and saying how GSP, one of the most athletic, jacked looking fighters historically, he was, very successful in a pre-USADA era. And he was saying, if you're in a glass house, don't throw stones. And I thought it was a pretty bold statement to be like, he was basically insinuating that GSP used to take shit, left the UFC when USADA came into the picture. And then who are you, like you, to claim that Jake is on PEDs,
right,
given the evidence is way more in favor of.
We started the whole testing thing, self-testing.
Yeah.
George hired VADA to test himself and his opponents. Paid out of pocket. It was an out-of-pocket expense. It was an out-of-pocket expense. Now, we wanted Johnny Hendricks to test with VADA, and VADA's protocol was that they post the results, no matter what the result is.
Yeah,
they post it. It's out of your hands. Once they test you, that's it. It's completely out of your hands. It's random. It's and I was on the call with the Johnny Hendricks camp. It was me, the UFC, their lawyers, our management from Georgia's team, Johnny Hendricks' management, and we're trying to make a deal where we're all going to sit down and make sure everybody's happy. And they wouldn't agree to VADA testing. They wanted the Nevada State Commission to test him. Johnny didn't trust nobody with his. They didn't want to do anything with VADA, and UFC didn't want to deal with VADA. I assume there's like a political beef. I offered to pay from my own pocket. George would pay VADA. I would pay the Nevada State to do it. So we'd get private testing from both sides.
Yeah.
And no, they didn't want to. So George ended up testing by himself. He ended up doing VADA testing by himself. Johnny Hendricks did no testing for that fight. And we're all about that. Okay. Whenever we're asked to test this, and I've said this years ago. Okay. When George was in his prime, I said, we're ready to do blood testing, blood, hair, and urine anytime. Anybody want to challenge us? Nobody ever took us up on it. We did it. We tested our camp ourselves just to prove to the world. Now, here's the thing. George is a freak athlete. Yes, he is. But do me a favor. Go see the receipts. Go see his first fight. What age did he start training? Go read his biography. His father was a black belt. He started training since the age of 5. Now, it's not uncommon to train somebody from the age of 5 that he's going to be a ripped freak by the time he's in his 20s. Of course, obviously, the guy literally has 15 years of training under his belt. He started training before puberty. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Tudor Pompa. Tudor Pompa did a massive research on every world champion and what age did they start.
No, I've never seen that.
It's a great book called Periodization, and he starts off explaining to you that he's collected data from all world champions. What age did they start? It's always before, during, or right after puberty, but never too long after puberty. Okay, so you'll never find a gymnast that started training at the age of 20 and made it and won a gold medal. It'll never happen. Why? They all start before puberty. Why? Because there's a lot of theories why, but generally speaking, when you're young, your brain is less wrinkled, and as you age, your brain wrinkles. Okay, it wrinkles to a further degree. Of course, a baby's brain is wrinkled, but it's much smoother compared to an adult brain. You become hardwired. That's why they teach you to read when you're young, because it's very hard to learn to read or a language when you're older.
Yeah.
Like you learn, I don't know if you're whatever languages you learn them just by hearing. You don't know the grammar rules or anything like that. You know them intuitively. If you grew up hearing two or three different languages, like my kids speak 3 languages. Why? They grew up hearing 3 languages. They didn't go to a French and English school before they could speak. They could speak before they went to school. Just by hearing it. If you ask them grammar laws, the rules, they don't know. They don't understand the ins and outs of grammar. However, they can speak the language. So if you learn at a very young age, and different sports have different ideal ages to start, but boxing, if I remember correctly, is around the age of 12 or 13, like just when you hit puberty, not before and not too long after. Now, there are exceptions. You could find a guy, like, for instance, Bernard Hopkins. really started boxing at 27.
Mm.
But this guy, you could see right away, this guy was a great athlete.
Yeah.
He was a freak athlete. After his first fight, we could tell he was very special. Like in Ngannou, for instance. In Ngannou, he hit the power cube. Okay.
Yeah.
The power cube. He hit the power cube. A sledgehammer is 100,000 on the power cube. If you take a sledgehammer and hit the power cube, you'll score about a 100,000 score. Like when I hit the power cube, I hit like 60,000. Okay. Which is like, it's a good punch. It's not a great punch. It's just a good punch. Ngannou hits 240,000.
Jesus Christ.
You understand?
Yeah.
So if he hits you, you're getting hit with a sledgehammer twice. You understand? Yeah. He's that dangerous. Now, Michael Kogan wrote one of the best books I've ever read, honestly. It's called The New Power Program. He talks about what creates human power. Like, why do some people hit harder than others? Why do some people jump further than others? And number one, it's not a muscle type, fast twitch or slow twitch. It's where your muscle is attached to your bone. Millimeters or miles in this case. So for instance, like if your bone, it's leverage. Like let's say if your bone if your muscle is attached a little farther on the lever, which is your bone, you'll have more power. You'll create more power. It's like a crane, like a crane, it has to lift at the right spot. There's an increased amount of leverage if your muscle is attached at a certain place in your bone. These things you cannot, by the way, the Germans, the Nazis, they tried to experiment with reattaching muscle to bone, trying to create super soldiers and carry more geared, travel further. They invented drugs, by the way, all these PEDs, they invented it. When it's not an accident that the Russians were the best in the Olympics after the Germans. They're the ones, when Berlin fell, the first to get all the data of drugs was Stalin, the Russians. So you have these Germans that were incredible in the Olympics. They were already on PEDs. And then after that, you had a boom in the USSR. They had a boom of athletic performance. Why? They had all the data from the German scientists who invented drug. They invented meth, etc. They invented all sorts of drugs. But still, the number one factor on the list of power is not fast or slow twitch. It's not skill. It's where your muscle is attached to your bone. So if you want to hit like a Mike Tyson and you have the same exact mechanics as a Mike Tyson, you won't hit like a Mike Tyson. Why? Power, like the sprinting coaches say, we can make you faster. We can't make you fast. If Usain Bolt never trained track and field, and I trained my entire life track and field with the best coaches, and me and him lined up in the prime of our athletic fitness, and we ran 100 meters, he would beat me. He would beat me. Why? Because the level of, there's no skill involved. There is some skill to sprinting. I know people are going to jump on me now. They're like, no, sprinting is also skill. Yes, there is some skills to sprinting. I
think everyone knows like generally what you're trying to say.
It's torque. It comes down to torque. Now, for instance, by the way, what's that guy's name? I forget his name. He was a great runner. Anyways, but even Usain Bolt is critiqued for his technique. His running technique is not perfect. However, he's still the fastest guy on the track. Why? It has to do with genetics. He's predisposed for running. Now, if you ask him to run a 100-kilometer race, he might not be the best guy. Other guys are more predisposed to that sport. So predisposition has a lot to do with your success. Now, if we're talking about soccer, it's not the fastest guy that's going to win. Now, there are other skills involved. There are other tricks. I can use ball control to beat your speed. I can use all sorts of different, I can use creativity, memorize more plays. MMA is like that. Just because you're more explosive than me doesn't mean you could beat me. I can use my wrestling to wear you down. There's a lot more strategy and skill involved, even though athleticism is still very important. But when it comes to sprinting is highly dependent on your athleticism and not on your skill. It doesn't take me long to teach you how to run.
Right.
You just have to run good enough to beat that guy who has less torque than you.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, definitely. The one thing about the like circling back to the USADA thing, the enactment of it, and kind of the criticisms of GSP and whatnot, like obviously we know your stance essentially, but one thing I found that was interesting was recently, like as of a few days ago, apparently GSP did a podcast where he said not only did Johnny refuse to do the drug testing, but he learned that UFC told Johnny not to do it, apparently.
Yeah, from what I understand, on being on that call, I think there was just a beef between them and Vara. I think I don't want to get too much into it because I don't know if I'll get in trouble for saying for being on that call. I think it was privileged, but there was just I think it was just a political thing, and or maybe Johnny's team didn't want to be tested.
Yeah. Well,
Maybe
yeah, he
they were
was
like,
definitely
"Hey, we're
one
not
of the
doing
guys
testing."
who fell apart after you said
Because
it.
he
So it's
agreed
pretty
to
obvious why he wouldn't want to do it.
he agreed to it at first publicly. He was asked publicly, "Would you do testing?" And he said yes. Done. I was like, I told the George's management, send them the paperwork. Don't even ask. Just send it to them. He said yes. We just have an agreement. Send it to. Let's start VADA right now. And no, we had to get on a call. It was you know, everybody wanted to meet. And the first thing they told us, well, we're not doing VADA. There's no VADA. So at the end of the day, we said no. We said it publicly. We're doing it. We're going through it. George St-Pierre went through it alone.
Yeah.
They took blood and urine. They tested him at random, and he's the only one who went through it. He kept his word. So for me, you know, I hope that makes everybody happy, because what else do you want us to do? And I, for years, asked people who have doubts, test blood, hair, and urine anytime. And nobody ever took me up on it till we tested ourselves, show the world. But here's the thing. If you look at George since he's a young teenager, he was always ripped. He's an ectomorph. Okay, this guy, whether he changes his diet or not, he's still very, very lean. There's about like 20% of the population. We all have a friend like that. He eats whatever he wants and he's still lean. Now, being ectomorph or mesomorph or endomorph is usually upon conception. What part of the fetus, believe this or not, what part of the fetus I'm forgetting, the egg is attached to. So I'm sorry, I read it vaguely once. They were explaining what influences. Of course, your parents, your genetics, so you have more chance to become an ectomorph if both your parents are ectomorph. But if you have a mother that's, let's say, endomorph and your father is mesomorph, what are you going to be? You could be a blend, because you could be a blend of the two. However, you can fall endomorph, you can fall mesomorph, you can fall even ectomorph. You have smaller chances of it, but it's still possible. So I mean, they have a science for it. That's not my field, but I've read about it in the past, and it explains a lot. You know, it explains why some people can eat what they want and never gain weight. Now, ectomorphs have a hard time gaining muscle.
Yeah.
So you have two ends of the spectrum: endomorph and ectomorph. Okay, endomorphs gain muscle really, really quickly and fat very quickly. They're usually more like an H. They look like an H. Whereas you have ectomorphs. Ectomorphs usually look more like an I or a V. They have very slender hips, and then they go into a V, or they can have very slender shoulders as well, and they look like an I. The ectomorphs have a hard time gaining muscle, but they're more predisposed to long distance endurance, but also have a hard time gaining fat. Knowing this, we spent a lot of time making George do heavy lifting. Why? Because his weakness is putting on muscle. Now, if you ask George, what's the perfect training regimen? He's going to tell you, oh, Olympic lifting, explosiveness, just explode. But I tell George, that works for you. It doesn't work for that guy. The guy who's an endomorph, the guy who's, let's say, very short and explosive, he needs to hit the track. His weakness is anaerobic endurance and aerobic endurance. That guy, if I make him lift weights, he's going to add 20 pounds. He's going to die at the weigh-in.
Yeah.
You understand? I need to train that guy differently than you. But if you ask George, what's the best thing? Oh, I never run. Only short runs. Only short runs are the best. Yeah, we make George do short runs because it's more anabolic. He's already predisposed to long runs. Like George can run forever. You know, he'll just stop running when he's bored. We wanted to keep muscle. Muscle was always the first priority for George, keeping muscle on his frame. Because if I made George do long hours of training, he would have got he would have lost weight. He would have got small quick.
What did he walk around at? Like, you know how in general, like guys like Costa, they will, cut down to just make weight, and then they'll super compensate up to like 215 when they step in the ring or shortly thereafter. Like, what was George's like super compensation weight that he'd actually walk in the ring at?
He'd fluctuate between 185 and 190, but not much heavier than that. He was not a huge welterweight. Like when he
started his career, what was his kind of like, how much muscle did he gain from the start of his career to like peak prime?
Well, I would say he was pretty stable. But the thing is, we kept the muscle on, because don't forget, when you do long hours of training, you can get into a catabolic state where you start to lose muscle. Like boxers, for instance, are not very muscular, but they don't have to wrestle. Again, boxers are muscular, but I'm comparing them to wrestlers now.
Yeah.
and MMA fighters. MMA fighters and wrestlers would generally be more muscular than boxers. Why? Because we have to wrestle, and you need more muscle. It's more ATP, it's more glycogen than aerobic when you're wrestling. It's force against force. So we put a heavy premium on George maintaining his muscle, because fighters can, like, if you look at Nate Diaz, for instance, he's not overly muscular at all.
Yeah.
Why? Well, he does long Ironman workouts, which I think is a problem for him, because he's an ectomorph and he's doing long distance running. Why? I would have him doing the opposite. I would make him do 100-meter, 200-meter sprints. I would have put a lot more muscle on him. That's why, in my opinion, he never developed as a really good wrestler.
Yeah.
Because you're training aerobically, and then when you get into an anaerobic exchange, wrestling exchange, you lose.
Right.
So if you look at Khabib, he's very muscular and he's got a lot of meat on him. That's exactly what a wrestler is supposed to look like. I have to give you that build for you to wrestle. So a Nate Diaz, in my opinion, will never out wrestle a Khabib. Not because of you can make Nate wrestle just as often as Khabib, but he's not built to wrestle. He's built to strike, and that's why he always excels in striking. Striking is more aerobic.
Right.
So he's training aerobically too much. So he's going to fall behind in the anaerobic portion of the MMA fight. Whereas, you have some guys that do the opposite. They lift way too much weight, and when it comes to striking, they're just a little bit slower, a little bit weaker. They get tired from the exchanges. So there's a proper balance. George was always predisposed to striking and aerobic work. So we did the opposite, because George also grew up doing karate.
Right.
So for him, punching and kicking, he was very efficient. He'll never get tired punching and kicking.
So, like, one of the things, from what I understood, one of his main motivations to leave the UFC in, I think it was 2013, was the last fight against Hendricks, right? The UFC 167, before he came back in 2017.
No, I think he had 2 ACL tears.
Okay.
I think he had 1 or 2 ACL tears, because he had ACL tears soon after. I can't remember if it was before or after the Johnny Hendrick fight. And just basically, I don't think he had the motivation to keep training like he did.
Okay.
He did do USADA testing when he fought Michael Bisping. He went back into the pool, and he was tested before and after the fight for a prolonged period of time. You have to stay in the pool of testing. So he's done it, and he's been tested in the past as well, testing himself when he fought Johnny. So we were all for USADA. Like, nobody, but it was at the tail end of his career. He was in the Guinness Book of World Records for most hours spent in the octagon at that point. I think he got surpassed later by Frankie Edgar, but his knees gave out for him from underneath him. That's the truth. He had 2 ACL tears, and that's a very long journey. That's basically your 6 months in a cast. It's a very, very long journey. And also, he was 30 plus now. He wants to have a family. He's been fighting full time since he's, I would say, 19. And the UFC, after the Johnny Hendricks fight, they wanted him to fight 3 months later, and he's like, man, like, he's not going to go back into training camp right away. It's being champion. You have to fight every 3 to 4 months. Yeah, it's a lot of pressure. It's difficult to live that lifestyle. He did it for 9 years straight. Think about it. He had a stellar run. It's got to end sooner or later. Right.
Makes sense. So is one of the main questions too, and this sort of came up in that interview the other day, is he mentioned how the Anderson Silva super fight, when they were in their prime, never happened, partly because UFC did not have strong drug testing procedures at the time. Is that, like, I can understand why somebody would say that, given that Anderson's popped multiple times now. So maybe that was a smart move to never actually do that. But like, do you think that was the primary motivation? Like, when you guys talked about it?